as easily. Oops. All right. So we'll be talking about, again, we're going to review ADHD symptoms and causes, problems associated with ADHD, how ADHD affects thinking and behavior management. We're going to talk about how it affects family school functioning. I'll talk a lot about using behavioral strategies to manage ADHD. We'll talk about the role of medications, benefits as well as limitations. Also talk about some ways to deal with your own understandable frustrations. And I'll pause for questions as we go along, so don't hesitate to ask. All right. So there are basically three core symptoms of ADHD. You have inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Inattention includes things like being forgetful, being easily distracted, trouble shifting your attention, being disorganized, losing things, and avoidance of tasks that are difficult or boring. Hyperactivity has to do with being fidgety, talkative, restless, being loud on the go, trouble sitting still, getting out of your seat, those sorts of things. And impulsivity involves interrupting others, blurting things out, acting without thinking, which causes all sorts of problems, obviously, in functioning. Now, in terms of diagnosis, I'm not going to get too far into that, but I just want to mention here that ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, can have three different subtypes. You can either have primarily an attentive type, primarily hyperactive impulsive type, or combined type, okay? And the ones that are more inattentive, sometimes they're harder to diagnose and identify early on because it's not as visible. The hyperactive kids or the impulsive kids often get identified sooner because they cause more problems in functioning, especially at school. So sometimes you don't, we work with middle schoolers, teenagers who may not have been diagnosed when they were younger, but the symptoms become more prominent as they get older because their ability to handle the organizational demands of school, as those demands get higher and more involved, they start having trouble functioning. All right, let me talk a little bit about ADHD and brain functioning. ADHD is a neurobiological disorder that impacts, we think about 9% or so of children and teens today. It's not the result of bad parenting, watching too much TV, a lack of discipline by parents. Those are not causing ADHD, or playing too many video games, though that could be an issue, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It's a genetically based disorder. It runs in families. So if you have children with ADHD, chances are you have a parent, a sibling, an aunt or an uncle, maybe even a grandparent who most likely has the disorder as well, okay? Some people think it's some sort of made-up disorder by drug companies to get rich, and I'm not saying there isn't a profit motive there as well. Sometimes it's overdiagnosed and sometimes it's underdiagnosed. But one of the things that we do know is that not treating ADHD can cause all sorts of problems as kids get older. So prefrontal cortex here, that's the front part of our brain. That's the part that thinks, that's the part that makes us more uniquely human. And that part of the brain, which involves controlling emotional responses, paying attention for extended period functions that are primarily in the prefrontal cortex. So one of the problems with ADHD is those parts of the brain mature last. And so that we think that they don't fully mature until around age 25. And so we also think that kids with ADHD may be a little bit more behind than some of their peers, which is why they often appear to be a little bit younger than their stated age in terms of their behavior, in terms of their ability to, again, control their impulses and stay focused. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about dopamine. Dopamine is one of the chemicals that is involved in ADHD. It is a neurotransmitter. It's in the brain. It helps things be rewarding. And one of the theories about dopamine and ADHD is that people with ADHD may have lower levels of dopamine in their brain, okay? And so what happens is when you have those lower levels, things are less rewarding because dopamine makes you want to do stuff. And so one of the things that we do in terms of treatment is that we want to try to make the dopamine work harder. And so when you make it work harder, you try to correct for that dopamine deficit, which makes things more rewarding to kids. Kids will, on medication, when it works really well, will say things like, you know, the medicine makes me want to do my work. It makes you feel good about getting stuff done. Some people will say that, okay, well, my child can focus well on things that they want to do, such as video games. Well, that is true because those are more inherently rewarding and those are fast paced. So it's much more likely to keep kids more focused and entertained. So it's not like they just don't want to focus on everything else. The interest in it makes it easier for them to focus and provides a little bit more natural dopamine. All right. ADHD brain looking for dopamine, sensing greatness. So if you look here, you're not finding any of these activities, making your bed, putting your clothes away, uh, feeling rewarding. And so if you do something exciting, that feels better and they'll gravitate towards that. There's some people with ADHD who are more sensation-seeking ADHD people. They need a lot of stimulation to feel good. And so they may gravitate towards more sports or, you know, exciting activities. And again, playing a video game and defeating enemies online, playing with your friends, that can be very rewarding for kids, which is why, again, they gravitate on those sorts of things. It also explains a little bit about when you put a child with ADHD in the room and expect them to do their homework, they get distracted easily because they find something else that is more interesting to them. It's not like they're purposely frustrating you on purpose, generally speaking. It's more that, that again, those things catch their interest and they lose track of time for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit as well. This is a SPECT imaging. This is a way of assessing brain functioning. And I just find this interesting because this diagram shows the amount of glucose that your brain is using. And if it's using glucose, it means that parts of the brain are active. And so the normal brain here has a lot of activity going on. With the ADHD brain, those little holes in there doesn't mean that there's holes in the brain. It just means those areas of the brain are less active. And so when you treat them for the ADHD with a medication that works, that activates some of those areas of the brain. So it tries to normalize brain functioning. And you can measure this as well. This is not a typically done test for ADHD. It's pretty expensive, but the research is very interesting and is consistent with what we do know about ADHD. And again, I point out some of these biological factors because some kids feel very ashamed about their difficulties functioning. There was a book written for teenagers a while back, actually a number of years ago, and the title is "You Mean I'm Not Lazy, Stupid, or Crazy?" And that's how a lot of times kids feel because kids with ADHD get a lot of negative feedback from the environment, from teachers, sometimes from peers, from siblings who complain that they're bothering them all the time, and certainly more negative attention from you because you need to tell them what to do more often than you do other kids because they fret, they forget, they get distracted, etc. So, but if you explain to kids that that's a biological underpinnings of this disorder and that they can be treated, they generally feel better about themselves. And kids who don't feel good about themselves are at much greater risk for getting themselves in trouble as they get older. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about some commonly associated problems related to ADHD. These are not specific to our diagnostic criteria, but they are often present and not everybody realizes that these are also related to ADHD. Again, being easily bored, dopamine deficit, I've already talked about that. Executive functioning difficulties. People with executive functioning is basically your brain's ability to get stuff done, to tune out distractions, to get your materials together, to follow through, to make sure you did it correctly. Those are all executive functioning roles or tasks. And people with ADHD have a very difficult problem with executive functioning, which makes it difficult to get stuff done. Impaired working memory. Working memory is your ability to keep information in your short-term memory long enough to for example, in math, long enough to solve a problem, to do mental math in your head, for example. Working memory is involved in reading. So when you're reading, to be able to remember by the time you get to the end of the page, the end of the paragraph, what the beginning was. If you can't do that, reading becomes much less interesting and more frustrating because you simply can't remember. Task completion is also involved with working memory. If a parent tells you to do maybe 3 things, you might remember the first thing, but you forget the other 2. And again, it's not like these kids are intentionally forgetting. It just doesn't stick in their short-term memory long enough. That's why things like lists and repeating instructions and things like that are so important, because that can't maintain it. Sometimes parents will, for the older kids, and this has worked pretty well, parents will text kids, okay, this is what I need you to do. And the text actually works better, especially if you do it one task at a time, because you know they're going to respond to a text, generally speaking. Trouble with time management and prioritizing. So time management has also to do with working memory. For example, as we're doing this talk, I have a clock here so I can keep track of the time so I don't run over. Kids with ADHD have a lot of trouble with time management because they don't have a natural sense of time passing. So they may think that they're in their room and they're working on something. Next thing you know, it's an hour later and they've been fiddling around with something on the floor. They have no conception that that time went on. And so then when it comes to finishing a task, finishing homework, and by that time it's time for bed, it creates, stress for everybody. But again, they don't have that ability to sort of just judge time. Prioritizing as well, that to be able to figure out what is the most important thing to do. Okay, I have a test tomorrow, so I really need to study for that test, as opposed to I'm going to work on this project because this is more fun. That's not due till next week, but I want to do this instead. And not a good way of prioritizing the tasks. They go for what seems to be more interesting to them at the time. And again, the problem with that is that they end up underachieving as a result because they're not getting stuff done on time. Emotional overreactivity. And I'll talk about this a couple of times during this morning's talk. That is often not typically seen as part of ADHD, but it's a very important part. So if you think of emotions as, again, kids are learning how to manage their emotions. It is a difficult thing. As we also know, adults have the same problem managing their emotions. If you're angry, you're less likely to think clearly, to react constructively. And so kids with ADHD are more overreactive, and that it relates to the impulsivity primarily. They're quick to react. They may say things without thinking about it, including disrespectful things that get them in trouble, because they don't have the ability to tamp that down. And that's something that you need to think about when it comes to how you respond to your kids once they get themselves into trouble for what they say or what they do without thinking. And so you want to try to keep as calm as you can to compensate for that. If you punish them for being impulsive in their reactions, it's just going to make them feel worse. And I'll just give you an example here, which again, I'll talk about it in a little bit as well. To say, hey, listen, I know you're really upset about this situation, honey, but talking to me, raising your voice like that really hurts my ears, and I can't really listen if you're going to yell at me. If you can bring it down a few notches, we can talk about this. And if they can't do that, just say, hey, let's take about 5-10 minutes. We'll calm down. We'll come back to this conversation. That gives them some extra time to think about it, to calm down so that you can have a more rational conversation. Yelling at somebody who's yelling at you is just going to make things worse. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. Now, if you personalize it too much, you're more likely to overreact. If you see this in your kids and you say, okay, he's overwhelmed right now, it will be easier for you to respond calmly. Other problems related to ADHD, screen time. So one of the things we know about screens is that they're actually designed to be addictive. That's a whole other talk that we won't get into today. But they're designed to keep you engaged, whether it's a notification. I mean, how many of you get notifications on your phone and the first thing you do is you want to check it, right? As opposed to say, I'll deal with this later. Now, someone with ADHD is going to have an even harder time tuning that out and staying focused on what other task that they should be focusing on. And the problem with this, if you think of being able to focus and pay attention and follow through on tasks, if you think of that as a skill that you are learning to do, the problem, and to focus on something that may seem relatively boring, that takes a long time, that takes mental effort. That if you're spending excessive amounts of time on a screen that is much more fast moving, gives you huge shots of dopamine all the time, it can impair your ability to focus on boring things. If you compare the activity of, getting a new skin on Minecraft or fighting zombies, whatever it might be, to listening to your teacher for 30 minutes talk about, some basic biology, it's going to be much harder for those kids to pay attention. And kids with ADHD are more likely to gravitate towards these screens because the making them addictive is actually targeted towards people like that because they're counting on it eventually to make money. And that's kind of my opinion there. But I just say that to be careful about that. If you're having problems, if your kids are having major problems with focus, limiting screen time can be a very good thing. It can be very difficult to navigate in a family. There are some psychiatrists who will not prescribe medication for ADHD unless kids are off screens entirely. I don't think that's practical in today's society, but something to pay attention to. It also can make them more emotionally reactive. Trying to tell a kid with ADHD to stop using a screen to interrupt a game can lead to meltdowns because it's hard for them also to shift attention away from something they're doing that they want to do to something that you're wanting them to do. Sometimes people will say ADHD is better thought of as it's like an attention shifting disorder. It's not necessarily just paying attention, it's shifting attention from what you want to do that's intrinsically rewarding or stimulating to something that you need to do that may be less stimulating and rewarding, at least in the short term. I've got a couple of cartoons here. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the cartoon Zits, but this is just a classic case of a mom trying to parent an ADHD kid. How's that big lit project coming along, Jeremy? Fine. When's it due? Thursday. This Thursday, how far along are you? What day is this? Monday. Oh, in that case, I'm 2 days away from starting it. And procrastination is like kryptonite to moms. This is a good example of a helicopter mom. She is so frustrated with her son for procrastinating, but it is just kind of how it goes. And it's hard not to be a helicopter parent when you're dealing with someone with ADHD, because the reality is if you leave them totally to their own devices, they're not going to do as well. All right. Let me talk a little bit about executive functions in a little bit more detail. This is just an example of a way to think about executive functioning in some of the different aspects of it. And as I review it quickly with you, I want you to give some thought as to just how that might affect your kids as you're thinking about it. Okay. So activation is organizing, prioritizing, and activating to work. That's getting started to do it, which is very difficult for kids with ADHD. Once they're doing it, sometimes it goes a little bit better. But again, it is that activation, that starting to get to work, starting to put on your clothes, starting to make your bed, put away your stuff, getting your homework out of your homework bag and doing it. Focus, again, includes focusing, but also sustaining attention on a task and shifting attention to tasks that are more important. Level of effort, regulating your alertness, sustaining effort, and processing speed. For some kids with ADHD, the more they try to stay focused and give something effort, the more tired they get. So they start yawning more, they get sleepy because it's difficult for them to maintain. Emotion, we've already talked about. Managing frustration and modulating emotions, very difficult for a lot of kids with ADHD. Memory, utilizing working memory and accessing recall, very difficult. That's why we want to try to use visual reminders as much as possible. For some kids, it works really well, for example, to put a laminated list of what their basic tasks are. You put them on the back of their bedroom door so they see them as they're going out the door. That visual cue can be helpful to kids with ADHD. Another example of something that helps kids with ADHD, if they're having trouble putting their clothes back in the proper drawers, if you just cut out a picture of what belongs in that drawer and you put it on the front of the drawer, that makes it easier. It's one less step that kids have to take to remember what goes where. One of the reasons that kids and adults with ADHD like keeping everything out, they don't want to put everything away because it's out of sight, out of mind. If you put it away, it's like it doesn't exist. You forget where it is. So it actually takes, it feels like it's going to take you longer to find it. Unfortunately, it just leads to more mess. So it may seem like a useful strategy early on, and there is some truth to that, to keeping it more visible. But the problem is when it piles up and up and up, then it becomes counterproductive because then you can't find anything. It can lead to things like hoarding. And then monitoring and self-regulating action, also an executive function that is difficult for people with ADHD. Making sure that you get stuff done, that you're aware of your priorities. So these are all examples of executive functions that work together in various combinations. And different people with ADHD may have different problems. Some people, their emotional regulation is pretty good. They're just pretty inattentive. Other people, they're just very, very quick to react, very emotional. They get themselves into a lot of trouble. So everybody's a little bit different. in terms of their ability to use these executive functioning skills successfully. The brain CEO or office manager, I just put this little picture on there just to keep in mind, there's all this stuff that's going on in the brain of somebody with ADHD. It also seems to be one of the reasons why it's difficult for many kids with ADHD to go to sleep at night, because they're thinking about all sorts of different things. And if you imagine this in a classroom setting, you can see why it would be more difficult to stay focused on one thing, because your mind is going to all sorts of different ideas. And it is very difficult to keep bringing it back consistently to what you're supposed to be focusing on. Let's see. I see some stuff going on in chat. Okay. Yep. All right. Thanks for the reminder for recording as well. Appreciate that. We've forgotten that before. All right. Okay. So let me talk a little bit more about the ADHD symptoms and their specific effects on behavior management. These are some things for you to think about as you're coming up with some effective ways of parenting kids with ADHD. Okay. I've already talked a little bit about some of these, but I want to reinforce them. Again, with inattention that leads to forgetting tasks, tuning out distractions, getting stuff done, and the out of sight, out of mind thing. And so give you an example of inattention. One strategy is to put something that's important in a place where you'll know that you'll remember it. For example, if you're having trouble remembering your medication and you put the medication in your cereal bowl and you always have cereal in the morning before you go to school, that's going to make it much easier because it's visual. If you take your backpack and you put it right in the doorway so that you have to trip over it to remember to bring it with you, that can be helpful. When it comes to forgetting, that's where like texting can come into play. If you have teenagers, and actually, as we know, a lot of the younger kids are getting cell phones as well. There are a lot of great apps that are available to help people remember. One of the things that I have kids do routinely is I have them put in their phones a reminder for our next appointment. And we go through the phone, teach them how to do like a reminder 1 hour before, 1 day before. I also work with parents on this as well, because these are strategies that will help them moving forward, so that if they know that they're going to forget things, they're going to take action. One of the things I tell kids all the time is like, don't assume that you're going to remember. If you have ADHD, you have to assume you're going to forget. So to be able to say, okay, I know I'm going to forget this. Let me do this right now when I'm thinking about it. If you get kids in that mindset so they can say that to themselves, and that ability to sort of monitor and observe yourself, that's also an executive function. That can help them in the long term to be able to remember those sorts of things. Hyperactivity, sitting is like torture. You know, they talk about everything but the thing that they're supposed to be focusing on. And think of hyperactivity, fidgeting, things like that. It's like breathing. You know, you can stop breathing for a certain amount of time, but it's only going to last. It's only going to last so long before you have to breathe. And sitting still can be similar. They can sit still for short periods of time, but then they're just moving, they're bouncing their feet or whatever. And a lot of times it's helpful to accommodate that. For example, if kids can sit through dinner, if they can't sit through dinner, is standing while they're eating that difficult? Some of you probably have seen some of these bouncy balls that some kids will sit on. Some of the schools have them. It makes it a little bit easier to stay in place because it makes it a little bit more stimulating. The fidgetiness actually kind of helps them stay a little bit more alert. And this is also something that you want to try to accommodate. I have a whole box of the fidgets in my office. If I see a kid having trouble sitting still and they're grabbing everything, I give them the box so they can look at the different fidgets. It helps them stay focused and not interrupt while I'm talking to them or talking to their parents, for example. Needing to work off that excessive energy. Sports are really, and physical activity is really important for people with ADHD, especially if they have the hyperactivity component. And so one of the things that you want to be careful of is some parents will restrict sports as a consequence for low grades. And I know schools do this as well. Some schools have grade requirements. You know, if you're failing courses, you know, you're not allowed to participate in sports. You know, some of that can be useful because it can actually help motivate some kids with ADHD to get those to bring their grades up because the sports are so important to them. But you don't want to limit that too much because that can be counterproductive. You know, sometimes teachers used to like take away recess for kids who are not getting their stuff done. If they're having trouble because of ADHD and you take away their recess, that actually could be counterproductive as well. If you take away the first 5 minutes of recess as a consequence, and 5 minutes is going to feel like forever to a kid with ADHD, that's going to work better. So try to build in activity. They need some discharge of that energy. There are some kids I've worked with where as long as they get regular physical exercise, they can get stuff done. They can go to sleep on time. But if they don't have that, they're just so wound up that they can't really sit down and focus. And so keep that in mind. That's really important. The impulsivity, reacting quickly, not thinking ahead, jumping to conclusions, etc., misjudging things, missing details. Again, these are things where, kids are doing things without really thinking about it. And when you skip doing your homework, that also can be an impulsive thing because you're not thinking of the long-term consequences when you're putting stuff off to the last minute. Again, without thinking, wait a minute, if I put it off to the last minute, there's no way I'm going to get it done. All right, so blind leading the blind. I mentioned earlier that ADHD runs in families. If you have ADHD yourself or some symptoms, even if they haven't been fully diagnosed, it's going to be difficult for you because you're trying to get your kids to do things that are difficult for you. And what I would say to that is that hopefully, if that is the case for you, use your own experience so that you can empathize more easily to the kids that you're working with. Because if you empathize with them and say, hey, I have some of the same trouble, because consistency is going to be hard for you, then maybe you can go a long way towards helping your kids not feel so bad about themselves. Consistency is hard. And so I'm sure you've heard this before. Oh, it's really important to be consistent with kids and all that. And of course, it's important to be consistent. This is true. But it's a goal to work towards. Don't beat yourself up if you're not completely consistent. For example, if you're trying to do a reward system and you have 4 kids and you're trying to do rewards for everybody, that can be overwhelming. And so you're going to most likely have to make it a simpler system to make it a little bit easier to administer. And we'll talk about behavior systems in a little bit. So, all right. Okay, hold on a second. Let me move up. All right. Why ADHD kids have meltdowns? Again, meltdowns are not part of the specific symptom criteria for ADHD, but they're very common. And so I want to talk a little bit about this because it's so important for you to understand where it's coming from so you don't overreact to them. So trouble sorting through thoughts and feelings is hard enough for kids. It's much harder for kids with ADHD. They get overwhelmed more easily. And when you get overwhelmed, that's when you're more likely to have a meltdown. If you're pressuring your child to do homework, for example, and they have struggled all day to stay focused and they come home and then they have to do more work and they just blow up. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing something wrong. It may be that if you look at it this way, their gas tank is empty. They've used it all in trying to hold it together at school, and then they fall apart at home. So keep that in mind. And again, being easily overwhelmed, emotional dysregulation is very common for the reasons I just mentioned. Thinking of kids as having lagging skills. There's a book by Dr. Ross Green that I would recommend if you have kids with meltdowns, and it's called The Explosive Child. And he says that kids do well when they can, all right? And it's not always intentional when they fall apart and misbehave or have a meltdown, temper tantrum, whatever, however you want to call it. And he recommends the use of collaborative problem solving. And there's a term that he also uses when it comes to trying to figure out solutions for kids. He refers to things as unsolved problems. And I like that because it really implies that there is a solution for the problem. It's just unsolved right now. So if you have a kid who's overreacting like this and getting themselves into trouble and upsetting you all the time, that's an unsolved problem. So you have to figure out, okay, how do we come up with a collaborative solution to the problem? And this is why it's so important for you to involve your kids in coming up with solutions to whatever it is. If they have some input into a decision or into a plan, they're more likely to follow through. If instead you impose it on them with no input from them, they're less likely to follow through. And that's just going to be more frustrating for everybody. Parental difficulty responding calmly. Again, as an adult, you have to expect that adults are going to have more control over their emotions, right? And it's kind of weird how that works. Adults can flip out and lose their, and there's not necessarily a consequence for it. But then a kid does the same thing and there's a consequence or a punishment when they're less capable of keeping their emotions under control. Again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, that might be a little bit of a controversial way of looking at it, but I think, again, it helps you have more empathy for your child. So if you think the better job you do at responding calmly, think of yourself as a fire extinguisher. Your role is to help put out the fire, not to add gasoline to it. One of the things you can do, for example, if you are too angry to deal with a child, you're actually setting a good example by being able to say, hey, I am too angry to talk to you right now. And if I start talking to you about what you just did, I'm going to say some things I'm going to regret. So I'm going to go for a walk and calm down. I'll come back to you in 10 minutes. That's a really healthy coping strategy. And you can teach your kids to be able to do the same thing. They're not going to think about it in the moment necessarily, but you can say, hey, do you need some time to calm down first before we talk about this? It's going to work much better. A redo can help as well. Again, if you remember, the kids are still learning to manage their emotions. I think it's much easier to look at this as an opportunity for them to learn in the moment. And what do I mean by that? For example, if you have a negative interaction that happens between you and your child and it's getting out of control, and you say, hey, wait a minute, this did not go well. Let's try this again. I'm going to come back in about 5 minutes and we're going to try this all over again. And you come back in 5 minutes, give them a chance to calm down. You might even say, hey, if we can handle this better, you can avoid a consequence. So think about how you want to handle this conversation differently. And you come back in as if nothing happened. Oh, hey, so what's going on here? As if you're sort of role-playing a little bit. If you inject a little humor, that usually works better for kids as well, because humor helps kids calm down. Humor activates the frontal lobes of the brain. So when you activate those parts of the brain, it is easier to keep the emotions under better control. So if you can do a redo, then that can help avoid, again, having to come with a consequence. And you're helping kids learn the moment. Kids with ADHD are often hands-on learners. You probably have heard about this. So a hands-on learning experience is allowing them to redo a situation so they can, again, have it go more smoothly, and it becomes a win-win for both people involved. Okay, let me talk a little bit about effects of ADHD on family and school functioning. We're going to get into some of the stuff where I know that it's stressful for you. And I think a lot of times parents, when they come to see me, they feel bad about what they're doing, blaming themselves. And what I should just tell them is, like, this is very stressful stuff. So you have to be gentle with yourself as well. Don't beat yourself up. Yeah, did you make a mistake? Did you overreact to something? Sure. But don't hesitate to apologize to your kids. I think it's one of the best things you can do with your kids, because you want them to apologize to you, right? When they mess up, you do it to them. That sets a good example to say, hey, listen, I'm really upset with you for breaking this vase after I told you not to throw the ball in the living room. But I'm sorry that I screamed and yelled at you. That was disrespectful, and I'm sorry for that. That also often makes it easier for them to apologize to you. So dealing with parenting in a child with ADHD is a lot more stress for everybody. Trouble waking up, because a lot of kids have trouble with that, needing a lot of reminders. There's going to be more conflict with siblings, parents, teachers. Because of the extra time you're probably spending with your child with ADHD on getting schoolwork done, it can leave less free time for other activities. It's normal to question your parenting skills because it adds to your stress. And you know that there's probably ways in which you're handling it that aren't so good. Resentment on the parts of siblings and spouses. If you're advocating for your child with ADHD, that can cause some resentment from the other kids. They may feel like they're getting treated differently. Like, how come I get in trouble for this, but you're letting him get away with it? And if you explain to them, well, you're all different kids, and so I parent you a little bit differently, that often doesn't go over well with kids, even though there's truth to that. Lower self-esteem for a child with ADHD can lead to more anxiety, depression, fear of failure. A lot of times when we see anxiety and depression, especially later on in teenagers, and also a lot in adults who are not diagnosed when they were younger, the anxiety and depression come from the difficulties functioning that are caused by the ADHD. And so sometimes when you treat the ADHD successfully, their anxiety goes down because they're more capable of getting stuff done, and their depression goes down because they are able to they're able to be more successful in whatever it is that they're trying to do. But keep in mind that lower self-esteem. So what you want to do with kids with ADHD in particular is make sure that you always look to point out what they're doing right instead of just focusing on what's going wrong. That takes practice, that getting yourself into that habit, but it's going to work well if you remember that they need more credit. They're already feeling bad enough. You don't want to make them feel worse. Because sometimes we think, oh, if you just make your kid feel bad enough, they're going to want to do better. No, that's not really how it works. They're just going to feel worse. And even more importantly, it can cause them to be more passive aggressive, where they resist you because they're resentful at how you're treating them. And then their motivation to do better goes down. Keeping in mind the lack of consistency with grades and performance, it's the norm, okay? It's sort of like the whack-a-mole effect. If you've ever played whack-a-mole at an amusement park, you put your focus on improving your math and reading scores, and then your science grade goes down, or your social studies grade goes down. It's very difficult to keep all those balls in the air. And so just kind of keep with it. I think sometimes people think, okay, if we just fix it, even if we treat it with medication, they're going to do great. No, there's still going to be those ups and downs. It's really hard to do. I really do like the example of a gas tank for people with ADHD. And if you think of the gas tank, you never quite know how much you have left. So if you spend all of your energy on one thing, or behaving at school, or on a sports team, whatever it might be, there's not a lot of energy left, and you just sort of run out of gas, and you never quite know when that's going to happen, which can be very frustrating. Okay, so I'm going to focus more on treatment and using behavioral strategies, some things that you can do that will be helpful in terms of helping things be calmer at home and hopefully more successful. All right. Remember that ADHD affects more than school for most kids. Now, this is more likely to be true if they have the hyperactive impulsive type. If you're just more inattentive, it's not going to cause as many problems at home. It's probably going to be more at school in terms of paying attention and whatnot. But again, it affects multiple areas of their lives. It can, even the kids who are in sports, being impulsive can cause problems. These are kids who may have meltdowns on the field if they miss something, if they think a coach, or a ref called a play incorrectly and they flip out, they throw their hockey stick, whatever it might be. That's fairly common. And so again, you'll see it in different areas. And so when you see that behavior, keep in mind, this could also be part of the ADHD. Successful treatment is critical because it predicts success in adulthood, okay? So how a child with ADHD will do in adulthood depends on, is best predicted by three things. It's whether or not his or her parents use effective parenting skills, how they get along with other kids, and their ability to be successful in school, okay? If they're having trouble with any one of those things, they're less likely to be successful. One of the things we know with people, particularly with untreated ADHD, they're overrepresented in the jails. Think about it. If you're having trouble paying attention and you're impulsive, you're more likely to do things, get yourself in trouble, break the law, whether it's stealing, burglary, vandalism, you name it, drug use, selling drugs, all those things can get you in trouble. And also, adults with ADHD, untreated, may go through 20, 30 jobs. They can't stay in a job for very long because they get bored, or they get fired because they're showing up late because they can't get up in the morning consistently. So this is why it's so important to use effective strategies here and to make sure that the ADHD is treated early on. Most kids don't outgrow it completely. We think about a third of kids might outgrow it for the most part. A third of kids may retain the inattention, but grow out of some of the hyperactive impulsive types. And then about a third have the full range of ADHD symptoms throughout their life. And so, again, successful treatment is critical. You're going to need to learn some new strategies. Some of the strategies, I'm going to talk about are things that you may not have been familiar with, or maybe you tried, but it didn't quite work. Okay. So by your learning new strategies, it's going to make life easier as well. And that's what most parents find once they get the hang of it. Starting earlier is better, but later is better than never. So don't feel like it's too late. Even if you have a young adult child at home with ADHD, they can also learn to be successful. It does require, obviously, some different strategies. It's important to follow through on treatment. With ADHD, it's not like you're going to treat somebody for 6 months and they're going to be fine and not need any treatment after that. Some kids do well enough and they don't need treatment for a while. Some kids, if they're on medication, may just need it during the week for school. They may not need it on the weekends or in the summers or when school's not in session because they function well enough. These are the kids who usually have better social skills, so they can get along better with other kids. But you do want to follow through on treatment. If you stop the treatment and you see problems coming back, it just tells you that the need for treatment is ongoing. Again, be sure to include your child in the process, especially as they get older. All right, before you start coming up with a plan here or a behavioral system that works, you want some data. So you want to know when, where, why, and how often these problems occur. For example, if you have a lot of problems getting ready in the morning for school, that is data that you need to know. Say, okay, well, what's going on with this? Why is this child having trouble? Are they going to bed too late? Are they just really hard sleepers? Are they avoiding school because they're really anxious about it? And so some kids have more trouble like at bedtime or at dinner time. Or just at school and not at home, or the reverse. So find out where the problems are happening and try to understand what might be contributing to them. Setting some goals and being specific. Good goals are ones that are clearly defined and easily understood by you and your child, okay? So it also helps figure out how close you are towards making that goal. It's like, cleaning up after yourself is kind of broad. Bringing your dirty dish to the sink after you're finished dinner, that's a very concrete goal. It's specific and easily measured. So that would be a better way of setting some goals. It could be grades, be specific. It could be all C's or better so that we avoid the failing grades. That could be an example of that. Breaking it into time periods also helps, because strategies that might help early in the morning are not necessarily the same strategies you can use after school, dinner time, or bedtime. And these are the 4 basic time frames that we're looking at if you think about it. Again, consistency is important, but not always possible, so don't worry about it. Do the best that you can. One of the things I will say is that kids notice if you promise them a reward for good behavior and you forget about it, they're less likely to want to continue to do that because they think that you're unreliable. And think about it. If you were never sure if your boss paid you at the end of your week, your motivation to keep going to work is going to go down. Be patient. It takes trial and error. So you may come up with a system and you give it a couple of weeks and then get together as a family afterwards and say, okay, what went well? What do we need to change? It's okay to experiment and try something new. And sometimes, again, having kids have more input is really helpful. I can think of one kid that I worked with that his goal was to have his mom not be on his back for everything. And as long as he got like C's or better, parents were okay with that. And so whenever the mom would get a report from the teacher that something wasn't handed in, she'd print it out, leave it on his bed. And he would look at it, and because he had an accommodation at school, he could turn it in late for partial credit. And that worked well because it was that important to him to keep his mom out of it. The fact that mom was a teacher at the school also made it harder for him, a little bit more embarrassing, but again, it worked. All right, I see some question and answers here. Do you medicate the 2 types of ADHD differently? It seems like the dopamines differ. Not necessarily. The medicines are pretty much the same. Some medicines, the stimulants in general work well for the impulsivity as well as the attention. There are some adjunct medicines like clonidine or guanfacine that are used for ADHD. We'll talk about that a little bit. That tends to be a little bit less effective for the inattention part and a little bit more effective for the hyperactive impulsive part. But again, it's really kind of depends on the person. It's different. Can ADHD get worse as you get older if not diagnosed and treated when you're younger? I don't think there's any evidence that it can get worse. What I will say is that the problems that it causes can get worse, okay? Because it's harder to intervene. If you intervene when a child is 8 or 9 years old, you have a fair amount of control over their environment. If you intervene when they're 17 years old and they're often on their own, you have less control over their environment. So it is more difficult in that respect. All right, let's go back here. Okay, here's some general principles in managing ADHD. You want to make sure that your child understands the rules and expectations. Post them helps. Asking them to tell you rather than repeating them also works better. For example, if you keep repeating the same commands over and over again, stop running, do this, do that, they're just going to tune it out. If instead you're better off to, for example, say you're going to the grocery store. Okay, okay, Susie, what are the rules for going to the store? And have your child repeat them back. Because if they repeat them back, not only are they saying them, they are hearing them from their own voice, and you can get a sense as to whether or not they understood. And you have to do that before any kind of situation like that. Okay, you've got friends coming over. What are the rules you need to keep in mind for having a friend over? I'm responsible for what happens. I need to I offer them a snack maybe, or let them choose first when we're playing a game, because that's being a good host, things like that. Establishing routines and try to stick with them. People with ADHD in general hate routines, but they need them desperately. And so, but the advantage of a routine, if you can get them to buy into it, is that the routine makes things more automatic so that you don't have to put so much energy into thinking about it. Kids don't go out of the house generally without their clothes, right? That's a routine. They get dressed before they go out of the house for the most part. They don't have to think about it. So if they can learn to like make their bed regularly, or pick certain things up, or brush their teeth, those are things that are routines. And it may be, okay, brush your teeth first, then a bedtime story after that. And if you do that over and over again, they can get to the point where they know and they don't have to be reminded. Along those lines, you also want to reinforce this and give them praise for this as much as possible. Anytime you see a kid with ADHD doing the right thing without a reminder, point it out. Hey, I really appreciate the fact that you cleaned up your toys. I didn't even have to ask you. Way to go. I'm impressed. That goes a long way. You don't want to just ignore that and only speak up when they do something wrong or forget something. Creating checklists, marking them off as they are completed, that can be very useful. Again, it's a visual. What some parents will do is they might have a list of 5 things that need to be done for the day, and by what time they need to have them done. You give the child the list. As they do it, they check it off. They can bring you bring the list to you. You can make sure that it's done, and they can either earn points or money or privileges or whatever the incentive might be. Giving clear and short, understandable directions. Less is more when it comes to talking. Again, remember low working memory. Remember the easily distracted. They might hear the first 5 or 6 words you're saying, but the more you talk, the more they're going to tune it out. So try to give it clear and short, understandable directions. And again, have them repeat back to make sure that they heard and understood you. Clocks and timers are very useful. Again, it's a visual. You can get timers online that have colors. And so like it's a color wheel. And so if you're in the green, you have plenty of time. And then it goes into the yellow. That means your time's running short. When you get to the red, you got to wrap it up. Some kids do really well with that. Again, it helps compensate for the difficulty managing time. Timers are actually very good when it comes to doing a task. If you make a task more rewarding, it's better. I have one of those sand timers in my office. It's like a 3-minute egg timer, actually. And that's how much time kids get to clean up. And if they clean up in time, they get to pick a sticker. That's one of the rewards you might have. And if they don't pick up time, they don't get the sticker, and they don't get to play with those toys the next time. And if you make it a race, it becomes more rewarding to them. Here's another example. If kids are having a hard time throwing things in the trash can, but you put a basketball hoop over the trash can, it immediately makes it more fun, and they're more likely to follow through because you're making it fun. Provide frequent feedback, more positive than negative. One rule of thumb might be that I've heard before is try to aim for like 5 times as many positive comments as negative when it comes to parenting kids, because the negatives really do a lot of damage. And the negatives often have more impact. So the kids are more likely to remember the negatives than the positives. So you really want to go with the positives. And again, it doesn't have to be all extensive. It could just be very brief. Hey, thanks for helping me with that. Thanks for cleaning up quickly. I really appreciate that. Thanks for putting your dishes away. The more you do that, the more likely you're going to get that kind of behavior. You can't expect perfection. So for example, start with when right. If you're going over a report card, for example, this is just an example of how you might use this. Don't start with the bad stuff. To say, hey, I see you got an A in this class. Way to go. How did you do that? How did it feel when you looked at the A and you saw that? It felt pretty good. Okay. So what grades were you not so satisfied with? Okay. All right, so this was a little bit of a disappointment. What do you think went wrong here? What do you think you could do differently in the future? That kind of thing. That really helps kids as well. Using when, then, or as soon as statements, I think are really helpful. And what I mean by that, instead of saying, no, you're not going out to play today, you haven't finished your homework, you didn't make your bed, or whatever it might be, those are negatives. If instead you say, hey, sure, yeah, you can go out and play. As soon as you finish putting away your belongings and taking your homework out so you can start it when you get back in, absolutely, you can go out and play. That's like saying yes or saying yes when you mean no. You're saying yes, as soon as you do this, this will happen. That positivity will go a long way towards getting kids to be more willing to do it. And then again, praising them for doing it. This helps kids focus on the positive as well, because again, kids often feel bad about themselves. And so you want to try to counteract that. Kids who feel bad about themselves are more likely to get themselves in trouble later on. Uh, the delinquent kids in high school are the ones that are more likely to be using drugs and alcohol and engaging in other sorts of behaviors because they feel like they can't succeed any other way. They're always going to be, for the most part, they'll be accepted by the drug using crowd, unfortunately. Setting up an incentive system, you can go to our website, cscc.info, and download a whole behavior chart that gives you all sorts of information on how to set up reward systems and gives you some sample items of what things you might want to put on there. You want to make sure that the incentives and expectations are age appropriate and something that's rewarding for your child. Some kids, for some younger kids, stickers are fine. For other kids, money works. Some kids are very money driven. And if that's the case and that works, I mean, most of us are probably money driven as well. We wouldn't go to work if we didn't get paid. If you're having trouble with school, if you could ask your child's teacher to set up a similar incentive system, try to keep it simple as well. There are all sorts of like one-page charts where the teacher can just sort of check it and sign it at the bottom in terms of whatever they might have done. And if you can, they can bring that home and then you can piggyback on that. And depending on their behavior that day, they earn a certain amount of, whether it's gaming time, time with you, or any other kind of incentives. You want to, as much as possible, plan ahead for problems and how to address. This is really important because a lot of parents complain about how things go when they're out in public, for example, or they're on a road trip. So if you know that there's, this goes back to the sort of figuring out the what, when, why, how of the problems. If you plan ahead and how to address it, you're going to do much better. For example, you're going on a road trip. You know your kids get in trouble, but they start yelling and screaming or fighting or whatever. If you have each kid say, okay, that's a problem. So what can we do to make things go better in the car? It may be they have headphones. It may be that they get to watch a video. It could be some kids would like to read. Sometimes a snack will help. And you help the kids come up with like a little backpack and to make sure that they bring it so that they have some coping strategies. It could be a fidget that they enjoy doing, just something to sort of pass the time. If they really melt down going to the store and they're always asking for something, you end up having to drag them out, kicking and screaming. That obviously that's no fun. So there may be a reward system that you need to set up that, okay, what is the expected behavior at the store? What happens if you kind of stay with mom and you don't go running in the aisles? You can even have them help you pick things out because if you engage them, they're less likely to cause problems. And then maybe they get to use some money that they earned from good behavior at home or chores or whatnot. So maybe they get to buy something at the store, within reason. Planning ahead and how to address will help quite a bit, as opposed to finding yourself not planning at all and then getting into a situation which could have been prevented had you taken some steps ahead of time. So let me talk a little bit more about incentives and rewards. I hear this more from dads than from moms, but I hear on both. Incentives and rewards are not bribery, okay? Bribery is illegal. If you pay off somebody to stay quiet, that can be considered, or you pay somebody so that they're going to vote a certain way that you want them to vote, that is bribery, okay? Incentives are like paychecks. You do well, you work hard, you earn something. And we are all driven by those incentives. So kids with ADHD, because of the lack of dopamine, need these incentives more than other kids because it helps compensate for the lack of dopamine. And the dopamine is a bit of oversimplification, but I think it's the point is still accurate that you're trying, because things are less rewarding to these kids. You want to try to compensate for them to make them a little bit more rewarding so that it's easier for them to focus. They must be valued by your child. If rewards are not working and they don't mean anything, they're not going to work. For example, one of the things that often happens when a system is not going well, if you have a child that already has everything they want, why would they want to work for it? Okay, I don't need any money. I don't need any incentives. I got everything I want. And that could be sort of spoiling. So you don't want the kids to have everything they want that's not earned, because their motivation isn't going to be very high. You know, if you have somebody who has $1 million in the bank, they're not going to be very motivated to go to work at Starbucks, right? They don't really need the money that badly. So you want it to be something that they need. Incentives also work better if they are given frequently in small amounts. Praise is one good example of that, but it maybe tokens can give frequently. The younger somebody is, the more frequent the reinforcement needs to be. Think again about the attention being limited, especially in the younger kids. And so if you say, okay, I'm going to give you, you have a 6-year-old and say, you're going to get a reward at the end of the week if you do everything right the entire week, that's way too long in the future. They need to be able to earn something on a regular basis and see the fruits of their labor, if you will. You want to make sure that the incentives are relevant to the desired behavior as much as possible. So sometimes if you have a reward that has nothing to do with the behavior at hand, it may not be as effective. Okay. So if the reward is, for example, if you do chores and you're earning money and you can use that money at the store, and that money, if you think about that, that's kind of analogous to having a job and working hard and getting money and being able to spend that money in ways that you want. You want to make sure that they're not something you've already taken away. If you keep taking away their video games completely, for example, and then they earn them back and you take them away, eventually they're going to give up on it because it feels like it's not going to be worth it. So if you keep rewarding them with things you've already taken away and that's your primary incentive, and you find that that's not working so well, it tells you, okay, we need to find something else. One good way of thinking about that is it's better when you're having an incentive system to start from 0 and work your way up. So that it's, let's say, video game time. If it's always earned every day based on their behavior, you're not actually taking it away. If they didn't earn it that day, that's okay. They can work harder the next day to try to earn it. As opposed to, well, you get 2 hours of video game time, but you messed up here. You got yourself in trouble at school, so I'm going to take all of your video games now and you get nothing. That's going to feel more punishing than to say, hey, I'm sorry you didn't earn your video game time today, and I can see why that would be disappointing to you. Do you think that you're going to do better tomorrow so that you can earn it, so that you, again, stay more positive? It's going to feel better. Think of this analogy. Say you go to work and you're working really hard and your boss gives you your money, paycheck for the week, and then the next Monday you come in and you missed a deadline, and they say, open up your wallet, give me back half of your pay. How are you going to feel? No, you're going to feel more anxious. You're probably going to feel resentful. You're going to feel bad about yourself, and your motivation to do better, probably, you may try to do better, but there's a lot of anxiety that may be associated with it, and that's not going to help. So may need to be changed frequently to keep it interesting. That's another thing that sometimes happens with incentive systems. Remember, kids with ADHD are easily bored. So if you find a reward was working well and then it stopped working, then you want to switch it up to something a little bit different. One of the things, and you'll see this on the behavior chart if you download it from our website, if you guys remember the blue light special at Kmart, the blue light would flash and, okay, just for this next hour, this item is 30% off. And that's done to try to make people buy an item that maybe they weren't buying. So if you have a blue light special at home, say there's a particular behavior. Let's just choose making your bed. Okay, and this is really difficult. Or brushing your teeth might be a better one because that's more important, obviously. To say, listen, I see you're really struggling with that. For the next 2 days, we have a blue light special for brushing your teeth. You're going to earn double points for brushing your teeth, and you'll earn triple points if you do it without a reminder and you come tell me that you've done it. And if you see that their incentive to do that goes up and they actually do it, that tells you something. That tells you that they needed more incentive to make it work. And that also makes things fun. You could just do it randomly as well. But it's really helpful if you find a behavior that's your targeting is not getting any better to try to do something different to make it more interesting. Here's some additional points to consider. Okay. You want to make it fun. Again, races, timers, I mentioned basketball hoops. Listening to music works really well for some kids. If you're having to clean up, if you do it as a family activity, it's going to be more fun. And if you make something more fun, they're more likely to want to go ahead and do it. Offering to help kids do what they're supposed to be doing is good, but you always want to ask first. Okay. So one of the things you want your kids to be able to do is to learn to do things on their own. So if you see them struggling with something, instead of just doing it for them, which might be easier for you because it's more convenient, to say, hey, do you need some help with that? Or do you think you have it on your own? And it's always a good sign when you have kids say, no, I think I can handle that. And that way you can praise them for that as well. Yeah, way to go. You were absolutely right. You handled that really well. One of the things I do in my office is I always offer to help clean up if they need some help. They just have to ask me politely. I won't do it myself, but I'll help if you ask. And if somebody says, hey, could you please help me? I say, sure, absolutely. And we do it together and it's more fun. And if that works, great. Because I don't mind helping, because sometimes having somebody else there with you doing a task makes it more likely to get done. Many of you, if you have kids with ADHD, are probably making them do their homework at the kitchen table, for example, because you're with them. If you send them to their room to do it on their own, it's going to be harder. So having somebody else with you while you're completing an undesirable task, it's almost like you're serving as an external focuser, if you will. It keeps them from getting as distracted. Extra points for doing things without reminders is a really good thing, because that's your goal here. You want kids to learn how to function more independently. The goal in disciplining kids is for them to become self-disciplined so that you don't need to impose it externally. But either whether it's extra points for doing without reminders, and over time, actually just praise often works really well. So that you look at that, you have to train yourself to look for the positives and say, hey, way to go. You did this without a single reminder. Excellent. And then watch your kids' reaction when you say things like that. They straighten themselves up. They feel a little bit better about themselves. That's what you want, because then again, their motivation to do well is going to increase. You want to give choices whenever possible in terms of time order. For example, getting homework done. It doesn't really matter when it's done as long as it's done. And if your child wants to go play first and they can come back and do it, no problem. Or, hey, we have 3 things we need to do tonight. Which of these would you like to do first? If kids have more say in it, again, they're more likely to follow through. And if it works well that way, then you can keep doing it. If on the other hand, every time your kid goes out to play and comes back, they can't get the work done because they are out of energy, you say, well, okay, that didn't really work so well. So let's try it this other way and see how that goes. Don't give in when your child is whining or having a tantrum. If you do that too often, then you're reinforcing or rewarding tantruming. What you can do for kids who are having trouble is you can say, hey, listen, if you can calm down and bring it down a few notches, you may have already behaved in a way that you lost a particular privilege, but maybe you could earn something else instead, so that they get something. But you don't want to, if you keep giving in when they're whining, then that's what they're going to continue to do. You can reward stopping whining. You can reward stopping a tantrum if they can do it calmly and redo it. Remember what we said about redos. If they can do a redo successfully, that may be sufficient. Talking about repeating commands endlessly. I hear this all the time. Again, they tune you out. Keep it short, keep it brief. Use extinction. Extinction is a behavioral term. It simply means not rewarding behavior. So if there's a negative behavior going on and you ignore it, that behavior is going to decrease because they're not getting any reinforcement for it. So often that's a pretty good thing. And then what you have to do is reward the positive behavior when you see it. Giving attention to the compliant child or the victim, not the aggressor. Again, kids with ADHD, because they're impulsive, because they're more hyperactive, are more likely to be annoying to their siblings. And the standard parent response is, stop doing that. Leave your brother alone. That gives more attention actually to the aggressor and may actually make it worse. Instead, if you give your attention to the victim and say, hey, what's going on? Yeah, your brother's bugging you again. I know. How are you feeling about that? Well, why do you think he does that? Well, he's got ADHD and sometimes he just doesn't think about it, Just let him know that you're not happy about that. And why don't you come with me? Let's go in the other room and come with me for a walk, or do you want to play a game or something like that? So you're giving the attention to the victim. The aggressor finds, hey, they're not getting anything out of this. The flip side of that, though, is that if that happens and you find that it works, you need to make sure that you always reward or give attention to the child when they're not being annoying, for example. So if you have the aggressor child handling things well, playing nicely, make sure you go out of your way to point that out. You can't just ignore the bad behavior and not pay attention to the good. Some additional points here is you want to involve all caregivers as much as possible. It's better when the parents, for example, are on the same page. If you have grandparents or a child care provider, better for everybody to be involved. It's going to work better. It's not always the case, but again, try to strive towards that. If caregivers do everything differently, that can be confusing to kids. Make sure expect your child to test the limits. It's normal and healthy. Your job is to help them do it respectfully. But testing limits, being able to be oppositional towards you, is that same skill that they're going to need to tell their friends, no, I'm not going to go get high with you today. That's a dumb idea. So I know it's frustrating if they're saying no to you, but that's a good skill to have. It's being assertive. You just have to help them do it respectfully with you. So give them the words to say, hey, Mom, I'm really not happy about that. Or why are you making me do this? I don't think it's fair. Can we talk about this? And then you have a discussion about it. You might end up changing your mind if your child has a really good reason to say, hey, that's a good point. Make sure your child needs the rewards. I already talked about that. Talked about reacting calmly to their failures. Shaming is not a motivator. Praising appropriate behavior, I've talked about repeatedly. Ignore mildly inappropriate behavior or redirect. That's a good thing as well, because again, you don't want to give too much attention to negative behavior. So if it's mildly inappropriate, if you see some hassling going back and forth, and you just intervene and change the subject, do something different, and that breaks it up, sometimes that works pretty well. Okay, let me just see if I have any. Right up.
Dr. Chris, if you're looking at the questions, I was going to suggest we save them to the end.
Okay.
Only because I think there's some specific questions in there that we may not be able to answer.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. We'll
Okay.
get to that at the end. Thanks. So when incentive systems or reward systems are not working, you would want to engage in troubleshooting to figure out, okay, what's causing the problem here? Again, if rewards aren't meaningful or lost their effectiveness, you need to do something different. If you are not giving the rewards when promised, that's extinction. They're going to be less likely to work towards the rewards if you don't follow through. If you're not consistent enough or undermine the system, giving kids privileges that are not earned. And I know a lot of times parents, if you think the other parent is being too harsh, but you don't want to undermine it because that's not going to work. Again, avoid too much of focusing on the negative because that's going to result in anger and then less incentive for the child to want to please you. If kids are not capable of engaging consistently, if you have a kid who's extremely hyperactive and you're telling them to do things and say they're not on medication, which hopefully would help, it's not fair to expect certain things from them if they are not capable, okay? You also, again, don't want to over-focus on consequences and punishment because they're the least effective form of discipline. All right, let's move here. So let me talk a little bit about medications. Medications are an important part of an overall treatment strategy. They don't fix everything. We think about a 50% improvement on average. Some do much better, some do worse. They don't work for everyone, okay? So if they don't work for everyone, or if you have a lot of side effects, then you really have to work much harder in terms of the behavioral strategies. Or if you choose not to do medication, and it just is probably going to take longer. Stimulants or non-stimulants, short-acting or long-acting. There's a lot of different medications. And if you look at this link at the bottom here to Attitude Magazine, which, by the way, if you have kids with ADHD, I highly recommend this magazine. Subscribe to it. They've got great articles. Comes out maybe 4 times a year. And they email you regularly with different articles about ideas about how to handle kids. I find it's a wonderful resource. So anyway, if you have some more questions about that, I'm not going to get too much into medications. I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. But that's a good way, a good resource for you. Stimulants tend to work best. That's like Ritalin, Adderall, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Some people use a short acting that maybe lasts 2 to 4 hours. There are other medications that can last all day, even up to 12 hours. So it really depends on what is needed. Often when medicine is not working well, you may have to adjust dosages. Side effects, you also have to monitor. Lack of appetite is one of the big ones, or sleep disturbance for the stimulants. And usually if you work with the doctor prescribing to try to minimize those, sometimes you have to switch and try a couple different medicines or a combination before you find something that works. There are risks of treating kids with medication. Again, lack of appetite can make it can kind of stunt your growth a little bit if you're not eating at all and losing your appetite completely. Some kids will get more aggressive on some of these medications, especially if they have another disorder going on. Those are generally rare. What I often tell parents is there's a risk of treating. Yeah, medications can have side effects, even though the stimulants have been around for like 50 years. So they're actually one of the medicines we know the most about. But there's also risks of not treating. So if you choose not to treat your child with medication when they really need it, and they have more problems with peer relations, with academics, with trouble with the law, drug and alcohol use because of that impulsivity, there are risks of not treating as well. So you need to think about that also. These are some of your options. I just give you, you can see a lot of these names you probably do not recognize. But you got the standard stimulants, Ritalin and Adderall, which the generic names are in parentheses there. There are a lot of different formulations of these two main stimulants, Concerta, Focalin, Jornay, all these different ones. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. Quilivant is available in a liquid form for people who can't chew or can't swallow pills. Some of these last much longer. Jornay is interesting because Jornay is a medicine for ADHD that's given at night. Usually you give medicine in the morning. You give it at night because it takes all night for it to be metabolized so that it kicks in the morning. So if you have a kid who's really struggling with those symptoms in the morning, and you try to give them their medication and it takes 30 to 60 minutes to take effect, and you don't have that long, that can be an alternative to consider. We also have a number of non-stimulants. Strattera is one you may have heard of. Quellibri is a newer one. Capve is clonidine. Tutiv is guanfacine. And then Wellbutrin. These are all non-stimulants. Sometimes those are helpful when you have side effects from the other stimulants that are not working so well. And we don't really know ahead of time who's going to respond well to which medicine. So sometimes it's just trial and error. So keep that in mind as well. This is also a handout here. Just gives you a little idea of understanding ADHD medicines. Generally speaking, the stimulants are the first line of defense. About 20 to 30% of people with ADHD, the stimulants don't work. Then you're going to try a non-stimulant, the second, as your sort of second line of treatment. Finding the right dosage is something that's called signs that your dosage or medication needs adjustment. Sometimes you try medicine, it works really well. Then after 6 months, a year, 2 years, it stops working. Sometimes you need a higher dose. Sometimes you need to switch to something different. So again, that's an individual sort of thing. Dosage is generally not, for the most part, other than Strattera, is not based on gender, age, or severity of impairment, but on the rate at which the medication is metabolized and how effectively a person's body absorbs it. So you can have a young child who needs a higher dose, or an older child who needs a lower dose. It all depends on how your body metabolizes it. Okay, a little bit of a sense of humor in here. Again, Zitz is one of my favorite cartoons. Jeremy, you can't procrastinate like this on your schoolwork. Why not? It's too much pressure. Well, I work best under pressure. I mean, that's too much pressure on me. Again, a helicopter parent. It is very difficult because you have so many competing needs. And so I just want you to be gentle with yourselves in terms of trying to do the best you can with raising kids with ADHD. You might be able to relate to this messy bedroom there. You got the mom who's a little OCD, a place for everything, and if everything is a place, I can't find my dresser. You know, all these people related. Very frustrating if you have different ways of doing that. So in terms of dealing with your own frustrations, we'll end with this. Don't make everything about school. And I think that's really, really important. I share this with you. I had a kid I was working with many years ago who committed suicide. And his parents were on his case about his grades, and he denied being suicidal, but apparently he was and just didn't tell anybody. And I see kids who get, again, depression is not unusual in kids with ADHD, especially if they're struggling and they're getting a lot of pressure. Don't make everything about school. Mental health is more important than school. And so you still want to have some good times with your child, make sure that they know that they're loved and that you recognize these things are difficult and that you're going to just keep working at it to try to make the best of everything. So be really careful about that. You need to be realistic in your expectations. Okay. It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to have a clean house all the time. They're not going to get consistently good grades. There's going to be ups and downs. So just keep that in mind. You want to pick and choose your battles carefully. Not everything's worth fighting over. You want to focus on the most important things. It's important to let your child make some mistakes. It's not the end of the world if they mess up, they get a bad grade. Hopefully they learn from it. We all have to make mistakes, and usually we remember more. When you make a mistake and you learn from it, that lesson sinks in better sometimes. Avoiding helicopter parenting, again, that's easier said than done. I know that's difficult. You do have to do some. Even most kids I work with will tell me, yeah, if my parents said nothing about my schoolwork, I probably would fail. So they need some. It's a matter of coming up with the right amount of intervention that will help. Maintaining a sense of humor, really important. And again, I know that it's hard. I know when you get really frustrated, that's the case. But a sense of humor it's sort of like think of Mary Poppins. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. If you can maintain a sense of humor about it, sometimes it just lowers the temperature in the room and allows things to progress in a more constructive way. Don't hesitate to seek support for yourself when needed. If you're somebody and often parents get diagnosed with ADHD after they see their kids diagnosed and treated and doing better, and then they realize, hey, wait a minute, I have some of those same symptoms. So if you're having some trouble functioning, if you have like ADHD or depression, anxiety, to try to get that treated if needed, or even just getting some support for yourself when needed. One of the things I do is I often will meet with parents. I always meet with parents pretty much for part of whatever sessions I'm dealing, because I know that you guys need support as well. Don't hesitate to get some therapy. Or if you have a kid who's in treatment, don't hesitate to ask for a separate session if you need it with a therapist, so that, again, you can get some support and maybe come up with some other ideas that would work a little bit better. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. So, I don't know where that came from. I think I hit the wrong button. All right, so summary and questions. Parenting a child with ADHD is a lot of work. If you have ADHD or other mental health issues, as I just mentioned, you're going to struggle more. Get help for yourself. You can't take full responsibility for your child's successes and failures. You just have to do the best you can. And again, your child's performance should never take priority over your love for your child, or in expressing that. That's really, really important. It does get better. If you can get these kids through the rough years, and the teenager years is often are rocky as well, most of them will end up doing fine. So you got to kind of hold on to the reins doing the ups and downs. Therapy helps, medicine helps. Be sure to participate in your child's therapy. You obviously are going to see something different from everybody else. If the therapist doesn't have input from you, they're really not going to be able to help as much with your child. You want to look for the positives and celebrate your successes, also very important. Because these kids also with ADHD, they have a lot of great things going for them often. They're often creative. They often are funny, good sense of humor, things like that. They've got a lot of energy. If you can help them direct that in ways that are constructive, it's going to go much better. All right, here's some other resources for you to check out. A couple of websites. CHAD is a national organization for people with ADHD. Another download that you can get for ADHD medications. Parenting ADHD, this is the Attitude Magazine website. They have a lot of good ideas there. And this is my personal website, jamesjchrist.com. You can listen to some podcasts with some other talks that I've given on other subjects: anxiety, depression, social skills, just effective parenting strategies. So feel free to do that. You can also get links to some of my other books on my website. Free Spirit is the publisher of my books, and they're great. They're the premier publisher of self-help books for kids, and they do a great job in terms of trying to help kids develop the skills they need to succeed in life and boost their self-esteem and help them feel better about themselves. Here's my contact information, and I think that does it. So let's see what questions and answers people have.